Hello and welcome to the Any Grief Goes podcast. And today I have Maria with me. Hi, Maria.
Hello, Breanne. Great to be here with you.
It's lovely to have you here. Would you like to introduce yourself?
So I'm Maria Belanic. I am a bereaved mom and grief support coach. And I live in Canada, the West Coast.
Yeah, and it's so nice to have you because I think you do some really interesting work, which we are going to talk about. I wondered if we could start with you telling us a little bit about your experience with bereavement and grief.
Story started a while back, decades ago, it almost seems like. And it's amazing how, in some ways, time seems to be still. In other ways, it has gone by so quickly that I can say, wow, it's almost decades. My son was diagnosed with cancer when he was 16 years old. And so we did sort of the roller coaster ride, I always go, the journey of cancer. From that, he did die of his cancer. And that is something that I think, looking back, it seems like with cancer, you kind of get used to it. You kind of get used to the roller coasters. With grief, all of a sudden, when he died, it was a shock to the system. It was in the sense of, I knew he had an illness that would cause him to die, and yet the reality of it never really kind of penetrated in. And I think because of the stress, and I've learned after becoming a grief educator, that the stress of going that cancer journey stayed within my body. And because it also stayed in my body when my son passed away, that all of a sudden I was left like in limbo. And so from there, I also think, so with grief, you're thrown into this overwhelming 180-degree where your world is turned upside down. I felt like I was upside down. And going in that, no one ever prepares you for what grief is going to be like. What are the emotions that you're going to feel? And it's not even just the emotions, but what is the reaction of my own body? And that is something that I've had to learn over the years, of giving myself the grace of saying some of these things I wouldn't have known because they were unexpected and no one else knew what they were. And I think to compounding that is also the family and friends that want it to be the way it was. And I always go, the way it was would have been my son would have been alive. Like if we could go back to a time when he's alive, yes, that would be fantastic. And that's not really what they meant. They meant for me personally, of who I was beforehand is who they wanted back. Unfortunately, grief changes us. And that is a conversation that no one ever has. No one ever shares that grief changes you. I mean, people will say, you've changed, and they can't really pinpoint why. Even though this traumatic event has happened, they still can't pinpoint what changed. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes complete sense. I have experienced that. Maybe you could speak a little bit about that then, because we know that just generally people don't know how to respond to people who are grieving. And I think everybody that has been grieving has come across somebody that they didn't expect a certain reaction from, or they're expecting more from. And it sounds like you had something like that. And what was that like, and how did you navigate that?
I'm not going to sugarcoat anything and say how easy anything was. It was really challenging being around, I think, other people also, where I felt that I had to hide who I was. And I think in a way in society, we already do that anyways, in some instances, because we feel that no one's going to accept who we truly are. And then add a layer of grief to that, then it becomes even more so. Like you seem to plaster a face or a mask the smiley face that everything is fine, everything's okay. And inside, you're a mess. And what you really want to do is show what you're feeling, who you really are. And
Mm.
sometimes we have a feeling like, I know I had a friend who I thought I could be my true self because it seemed like, my friend accepted me beforehand as my true self. So this is just another layer. And one of the things that my friend shared afterwards is like, I don't like who you've become. Like, and I guess part of that was they would see me in different situations where I'd have the mask on, where I'd be presenting that everything's fine, depending on what situation I was in. And then afterwards, it was like, you just feel like, like one of those balloon things where it's all puffed up and it's floating. And then all of a sudden, you just want to take the air out. I think sometimes there are friends that I thought that I could take the air out of myself
Yeah.
and be that limp sort of, yeah, this is who I am. And they're kind of like, yeah, no, we want the one where you have the balloon all plopped up and you're showing that up.
That's a bold thing to say to somebody who's grieving. And as if you haven't got, and that's the thing about grief, isn't it? As if there isn't enough to deal with, you then have to deal with stuff like this that does crop up. And I don't know how conscious people are of their responses like that.
Aren't. I mean, it's taken me time, um, because my grief is more, because my son died almost 15 years ago. Well, it will be 15 years. Also, that process that I've now learned that a lot of times people's intention may have been coming from their heart. They might have been well intentioned in offering support, in offering care, and yet it missed the mark because they also, I mean, as grievers, we have no idea how to feel, how to express. As a non-griever wanting to support someone, they have no clue either. And I know I always teach, take your clues from a griever. If a griever only wants to sit in silence, be okay with that silence. If a griever wants to talk and share their stories, listen. And I think a lot of times we're in a society that wants to offer solutions, wants to, I'm going to use air quotes, fix, right? They want to fix the situation. They want to fix the people. How can I make you better? To sort of sugarcoat everything. Like we want to make everything better. And it's almost like, okay, if I can say the right words or give you the right magic pill, you're going to be okay. And it doesn't work that way.
I think people also find it harder to speak with people who have lost a child. And I know that we've spoken before, and also we did the David Kessler Grief Educator program. So, we subscribe to the fact that anybody's, not to compare, everybody's grief, whatever grief you're experiencing, is the worst one that's happening. However, I think when it comes to a child dying, people really don't know how to deal with that at all. Um, do you find that? Do you find there's a difference in your work and people you come across and your own lived experience of people finding it more difficult?
You're so right, Breanne. I mean, there is no comparison. Whatever someone's grief is, that is their worst grief. And that is absolutely true. And you're right. I mean, we've both taken the David Kessler program, and there's so much wisdom in what he says. And that is one of the ones too. Because I think when we're in our own grief, we do have a tendency to compare. For son first passed away, I really did, I think, compare in the sense of, especially when other people would tell me that, they lost so and so or this like that. And I think when you're going through it, it doesn't matter who you've lost. It's the most profound loss and tragedy to that person. I will, of course, say that there are different nuances who has lost, whether it's your spouse, whether it's your parents, whether it's your child, because the relationship's going to be different. And also the nuances of, I look at myself as a mom whose son passed away. That will be with me forever. Like, so to share his stories, to say his name, do that. And yet when you're in with people who don't understand about grief, sometimes we'll look and kind of go, oh, there she goes again. She's stuck. She's stuck in that grief. And I've gotten people coming up to me going, oh, I know someone who you can help. You know, they're stuck because they're always talking about their child. They haven't gotten over it. Well, you don't get over it. And I think that's the aspect. And even in that nuance, whether it's your parents, you're never going to get over your parents passing away. Yes, do you move forward in life? Yes, you do. But parents cannot be replaced. No one can be replaced. Like even a spouse does not get replaced. You can get remarried and have a new relationship. It doesn't negate the fact of the relationship that you had with your previous person, the person who passed away. And I think sometimes that are the remarks that people get. I mean, I've heard people say to women who have lost their spouses, well, you can get married again, almost like, just interchange them. The same thing depending on if you have a child, depending on the age of the child. I've heard people tell a mom, well, you can have another child. These aren't chairs that we can be replaced.
In
Right?
comments, when I hear comments like that, it makes me wince. Like, oh,
That's the one thing that I think when you've had a parent pass away, no one will ever say, oh, at least you can get another one. All insensitive comments. And I think to a griever, depending on where your space is, can actually bring anger. I mean, I've had to
yes.
walk away from situations so that way I wouldn't get angry, especially in the early years. I just hear them, and depending on who it is, will kind of, say something gently to them. It's not coming out of anger anymore. It's coming from a place of peace and love and knowing that their intent was never to be an offset remark, even though that's what it comes across as.
Can you talk a little bit then about how you began to move forward after such a significant loss? You speak about it being in your body and you speak about anger. Can you talk about the different aspects of your experiencing and how you dealt with them and began to make some kind of way in the world again?
It was a long journey. I always go, I was in 10 years of limbo. 10 years, I always go of thinking something was wrong with me. And I think for a lot of grievers, we go through that aspect of what's wrong with me. Everyone keeps telling me that I should be getting over it. How come I'm not? And one of that is, I mean, I was taking different courses, I think development courses, trying to, again, as we go, trying to fix myself better. And part of it was, I mean, for my own body, I started learning that it was keeping a lot of my emotions in. So it was affecting my health. So in regards to that, I did find supplements that I started taking that actually helped off my body. I started releasing some of the emotions. So I found some tools that I was using, some strategies that I started using, whether it's journaling, artwork, things like that, that helped me release and express my emotions that I couldn't put into words. And from there, that's how I started the pillars of care. So I use care as a acronym, the CARE, in about what am I giving myself? I'm giving myself compassion. I'm giving myself awareness. I'm allowing my body to release the emotions and also what my thoughts are. Because a lot of times we delve with the emotions, but we're not delving with what our thoughts are. And sometimes what are the shame, the guilt, and the regrets that we hold in our thoughts that we keep hidden. And we are not allowing to be expressed. And I think that's where everything kind of gets interchanged, is how do you give yourself compassion and kindness to say it's okay to have these thoughts. I mean, I had all these thoughts after my son passed away about what a terrible mother I was. Because I think a lot of times there's this myth that we have these superpowers and that we can change any situation. And it's the same thing, I think, as a child. When you think of a child, when something happens to their parents, they take it as they've caused something. So whether we're a child, whether we're an adult, we internalize everything. We internalize that we have this superpower that we can change things, that if we had, or we can change a situation, or we can change our words. And part of that is also releasing the control, which is
Mhm.
harder to do than, it's easy to say, oh, release the control. But when we're used to that and it's sort of ingrained, it takes a while to really release that from our bodies, from our thoughts. And how do we get into this inner peace? And for me, through all my journey, one of the things that I did find and what I embraced was that grief wasn't going to go anyplace. That was one of the important things that I listened to myself, kind of going, who says that grief's going anyplace? Grief is going to be with me for the many days that I'm here on earth. And I know that sounds sometimes like scary, like, oh my God, it's going to be. And I think when we think of grief, we think of the heaviness, that the constant heaviness, especially at the beginning, where it's just so real and raw, and it's so hard to get even out of bed. It's so hard to face life. And we just don't know how we're going to be continuing on this journey. How are we going to face the next day? Is by saying we take it moment by moment. We take it hour by hour, day by day. And what I've learned is that my grief evolves with me. Even after all these years, I'm at peace now, but there are still days where I go back to like it just happened, where there's going to be something, whether it's a scent or whether it's a memory, that's going to activate me. And I've learned now to embrace that, to say, it's okay. I have every right to miss my son. I have every right to be sad. And I think we don't give grievers enough credit to do that, rather than saying, it's okay to sit in it. It's okay to allow your emotions, like give them the grace to be there without trying to hide it. And that's, I think, why it's so important to have supportive spaces, especially like yourself, Breanne, who is another grief educator, like myself, who come from a place of compassion, come from a place of experience, and also come from a place of where we're certified in helping others and in making an impact in their lives.
Tell us a little bit about your work then and how you use those pillars with people that you work with.
I do. Thank you so much, Breanne. I have a 6-week program where we kind of go through in the sense of, I always say it's meeting where someone is. So I'm not going to change anyone's journey. I'm not going to, right? I thought sometimes we need to let people know that, yes, there is a transformation. Transformation is going to be something different than what you expected. I think the society sort of wants us to be like from this end, and all of a sudden you're going to take a 6-week, 12-week program, and you're going to be on the other side with the rainbows.
Mhm.
And so to me, what the other side is, what is it going to look like for you? We go through, as I said, the acronym of CARE. I have tips and tools within that, but it's also about your journey. It's about the person's journey of where they're at. And we slowly, almost like peeling layers of onions, right? Like you think an onion is like this huge onion. And yet, if you really look at an onion, the layers are not thick. The layers are super, sometimes very thin, almost invisible. And that's what we want, is we want to connect ourselves, because we're not going to change who we are. It's acknowledging who you are right now, with the possibility that there's hope, that there's light, and that you can still have a future filled with joy and in doing what is your passion. I know David Kessler likes to put find your purpose or find your meaning.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times it's not even sometimes something really big. It could be something where the meaning and your passion is for your family of where you are right now. It could be helping people in your community, helping people where you are in your work.
Mm-hmm.
I think sometimes it's about redefining of what we believe grief is, and accepting that grief has many faces, so to say, right? There's no one size fits all. There's no anything that all of a sudden is going to be this drastic. And I think it's giving yourself permission to be who you are right now is really what I'm at. It's about, especially women and especially moms who blame themselves for a lot of things, is to say you're okay where you are and it's not your fault. And as much as we'd love to have this magic wand to sprinkle, we really have no control over what happens in life. We only can do what is best for ourselves, and how do we find our own inner peace.
You mentioned hope. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that because I think that's a big thing. A lot of people lose hope for the future, and I think a lot of that is based around fear and also grief of what they're not going to have now that person is not there anymore. And the loss of a child, obviously the milestones are more, and there's more that you would be grieving, more events that you'd be grieving. How
Mm-hmm.
how does hope come back? How does hope of that joy and a brighter future, despite the heaviness and the pain, come about?
Asking, I think I've always had hope. Hope has always been a word that is really close to my heart. I know even as my son was laying dying, one of the aspects that I always went is that I never want to take his hope away from him. And hope again can look in different ways. Hope can be interchanged with healing, in the sense of, and I use healing as healing our heart, not so much as healing as all of a sudden snap your fingers, you're better. Healing is because our hearts sometimes feel like they're broken. And there is this thing as the broken heart syndrome, which is true. It's a true medical term. Going through grief, I it feels like we're shattered. I mean, one of the aspects that I always went or described myself as I was shattered, that I was in a million pieces. And to me, hope means that I'm putting my pieces back together, right? Um, and it will never be the same as it was beforehand. And yet, through this experience and in my brokenness, there is a light that comes through the cracks. Light is the hope that I continue on for another day. And that day becomes a week. That day becomes a month. That day becomes years, where then I can start looking forward to planning things in my life. Now, part of that hope doesn't mean forgetting, because I always go, when we're in grief, one of my fears that I always had was, because we think of moving forward or moving on or getting over it, felt like I needed to forget about my son, that he even ever existed. And I think sometimes that is the aspect that the messaging in society comes across as, is that when we move on, when we get over it, or is that we're going to forget who our person was, who our person is. And I look at, and I'm thinking, no, grief is actually saying, I'm remembering my son. I will never forget my son or the love that I have for him or the love that he had for me. And hope just means that I'm intertwining the two together, where it's, I can do things today. I can do things next week. I can plan things. I can enjoy my life. Like when I go on a trip, I can enjoy that moment where I'm on the trip. And I think for me, that's what hope is. That's what I believe hope is that enjoying the moment and not being in fear that I'm going to forget this.
Yeah.
And even though there's the unknown, because I always go, sometimes I think I'm a little too much of a realist,
Hmm.
right? I always go, in life, none of us know what's going to happen. Everything's always the unknown. The hope just kind of says, even though I'm walking in the unknown, I will be okay.
Yeah, it does. So tell me how you got to this point. Did you do a lot of work on your own? Was it a lot of just listening to your own bodies? Did you seek out any support? What was it that helped you along your way?
Without support, this is one of the reasons why I kind of figured I needed to get into the grief arena and be a supportive. The support that I ended up getting was I disagreed with it. I
Oh,
just would go in and I felt even worse off.
what
And
was
I
it?
think it's because, yeah, because I think there's a lot of groups out there. Now, I know that they're changing, but beforehand, it still was the messaging that you got that something happened, your person, in my case, my son. And then all of a sudden it was like, okay, now you're just going to move on and you're going to get over it. And it was, the messaging kind of felt like, yeah, it happened. You'll remember it, but you know what? It's going to be something in the past. I thought it almost felt like you're at a crossroad, and to move on, it was kind of like you had to say, okay, here's my trauma. Here's my person who passed away. I got to leave that as a chapter in my story. And then I'm moving on. Get to bring my trauma and my experience with me, but I'm going to be sad for the rest of my life. That's kind of a terrible message to give a griever. Like it's either one or the other. It's like either going to be terribly sad because you constantly
It's,
remember and you're going to be stuck, or if you're going to move on, then you got to forget, like stop talking about them. And and that didn't sit well with me, because I'm like,
well, fair
well,
enough.
why can't I move forward and I get to carry my memories with me, both sad and happy? Because one of the things I always go is, you never forget the day that your person passed away. That still stays with you. It's like your brain, engraved in your body. I hate that fact. I'm kind of like, that just gives me more anxiety. That is the aspect that I think when I embraced grief, it's kind of like, no, they're merged together. Grief is also the love that I'm caring for my son. It's about, how do I have the pain where it's less, and I'm remembering my son more with love than I am with the pain. And I think there's a great illustration that I sometimes use. It's about a jar. It's about grief in the jar. How some people kind of feel like, here's the grief. It's a big ball. And over time, the grief gets smaller and smaller and smaller. When in actual fact, what happens in grief is that the grief remains the ball. It remains this ball, the same size. What changes is ourselves and how we end up growing beyond the pain. We actually add more love to our grief, and we don't And so that is what I infused. And I think that's why I kind of thought, because I've gone to see speakers, counselors, and I don't know, it just made my body cringe, saying this
Okay.
isn't right. How can we teach this to people and then wonder why they're getting ill? Because a lot of times people don't equate that our grief, when it goes unexpressed, sits in our bodies. Our bodies remember. And when we're not dealing with that pain, with those emotions, it's going to come out in different ways in our bodies.
Yeah, you're right. I think that is something that's not as understood, that you can have lots of physical symptoms that are purely grief related, and people will explore lots of different avenues first before they come to the grief. Are there any particular kind of strategies that you had to deal with the pain in your body?
I think it's everyone needs to find what works for them in how to releasing. I know for myself at the beginning, I couldn't listen to music. Music, I mean, I used to love music because I always found music just reaches down to my soul. And I think to a lot of people, if you have the right music, it just kind of expresses your emotions. I had to shut off all music. I think I was in so much pain that every time I listened to music, it even brought it out even more so. So for me, what I ended up finding, and I'll give this one tip, is coloring, or actually, it would do painting. So in this case, it's about your inner artist or your inner child that comes out, whether you use crayons, whether you use paint or paper, and choose the colors, the color of grief, of what you're feeling that moment. And you don't, you look at it going, it's not about drawing a picture. I mean, if you're an artist, go right ahead, like draw a picture. What I found, it's just, especially with, and I think paint more so because it's a little bit more free flowing. Brush, some paint, and you just scribble or whatever it is, flow. And that actually has a calming effect on your body. Like movement. There is grief yoga. There is sometimes, if you love to dance, you can express it that way. Even taking walks in nature. So these are things that I think has to match with what fits that person. And sometimes it's a modality that you would never think that you would ever use. I'm not an artist. I appreciate art. I appreciate everyone's our artistic nature. And yet what I found was just allowing myself to express myself through colors with my emotions. Because a lot of times, as you know, Breanne, words don't encompass what we're feeling. To find this right word of saying it. And I know that there is a feeling wheel, because a lot of times we don't even know what emotions we're feeling.
No, I mean, there's
And
lots, isn't there? And I think
oh,
we
there
only
is.
really
And
about 6 or 7 of them.
right. And even one of the aspect about sometimes where even the emotions, where we feel that if someone's crying, that's acceptable. If someone's angry, it's like, I don't know. And yet they're supposed to be the same emotions on the same coin. It's just being expressing in a different way.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting what you're saying, because I think being able to visualize your grief in a color or as an image, I think is really powerful, because I think it distances you just a little bit from it. And I think the more distance and more that you can observe the grief instead of the grief being you, I think is really helpful.
Yeah, so true, right? And I'm not too sure what are some of the modalities that you use or
What in my coaching?
yes.
So, yeah, so I use a lot of kind of, well, I draw a lot from the acceptance and commitment therapy, actually, of yeah, it's more like an acceptance, and you're not trying to be happy all the time. You're sitting with what is, and there's ways to work within your body in that as well. And also, yeah, self-compassion. So the work of Russ Harris in terms of ACT and self-compassion with Kristen Neff and Chris Germer, mostly my work draws quite heavily on those things, mostly.
Mm.
Yeah. But you're
Yeah.
right, it's so
And
important for your body.
I like how now, and I think it's opening up. There are more, I mean, you and I are both so fortunate in that we became grief certified educators, and there are many more people who've had the experiences who are becoming grief educators, which I think
Mhm.
is going to definitely serve the people in the world that are around that really need it the most. Because I find that I think a lot of times, people are using, I don't know if it's Freud or someone else, that they're using where grief is almost very rigid, right? Like you
Mhm.
have to have these different steps, and
Yeah.
grief then becomes same steps for everybody. It
Yeah.
doesn't take into account what a person's personality is, what the relationship is to the person who passed away. Uh, I mean, I look at it from a mom's point of view, is that every mother is going to have a different relationship with their child. It's not the same
Mhm.
relationship. Some are closer, some are not. And that is also part of the grief journey, is that, yes, we're missing uh, the person who passed away, but there's also so much that we're missing of what the future could have been, the things about our own selves that we're missing. Because I think a lot of times we also lose our identity and our worth. And I think
Mm.
that's one of the one reasons I always go, I was in limbo for 10 years, is because all of a sudden my identity, my self worth felt that they had also gone with my son.
Yeah. Someone that's lost a child, what would you want other people to know about that experience?
Never want anyone to experience it for firstly. Um, uh, However, every day there is a mom who is experiencing the loss of her child. Um, and it's a heaviness that really does remain. There are ways to find that lightness where your child will never be forgotten, that love remains. And that's really what my teaching is about
Mm.
how do you find your light, your inner calm, where you
Mhm.
still can live life and honor. That's one of the things that I really feel is important, is we honor the child who's passed away. We also honor our own selves. And I think that's always forgotten, is no one honors their own selves and who they
Mm.
are becoming.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And are those two things separate, or when you're honoring yourself or your child, is that also one and the same? You are at the same time honoring both of those.
It's intertwined. I always
Mm.
go, all of us are intertwined. I mean, really, to me, grief it's a heart, mind, body connection.
Yeah.
Um, I don't separate a lot of things because I always feel like, because I don't like the word balance, because it's not like we can find balance, but we can find this equilibrium sort of thing, or this harmony
Mhm.
in where we nurture our own selves, we nurture our hearts, we nurture our bodies, we nurture our minds. And it is a connection. And sometimes, people want to separate in the sense of, okay, it's everything's in the mind or everything's in the body. Well, no, because what's in the body is going to affect the mind. What's in our mind is going to affect our bodies.
Mhm.
And so I believe that we need to see it as a whole.
Are there specific ways that you have honored your son that are your favourite ways to honour him?
Learning more and more ways. One that I've always had is that I actually have his bracelet, right, that I made
Oh,
onto my wrist that is never removed. I
mm,
made it so that way it can never be removed. So it comes with me everywhere, the travels and things like that. We did at the beginning do some fundraisers. Because my son died of leukemia, we used to do fundraising events to raise funds for research, right? Because
mm,
there's more and more. I always believe that funds are needed. That is something that I've always believed in, and also I really truly believe in full for what to have or to give to my son. What I mean by that is because my son had cancer, we did always, I mean, I had my son write a gratitude journal in the
mm,
sense of what are we grateful for today? And as we live in part of the world, I could afford the medication. We could afford healthy food to eat. Um, that at times when I give to organizations that help other children, not as well off as a part of the country that I'm living in. So I think for me, it's about what speaks to my heart and how then can I help other children also. So that way they can have nourishing food, the medicine that they need, even just
mm.
for day to day survival.
Yeah, and those are all beautiful ways of honouring your son. Before we end, I wondered if you, yeah, tell us his name and a favourite memory.
Um, so my son's name is Stefan, and well, I have pictures of him that I'm looking at right now. Um,
Mm,
is always his kindness, right? In the aspect of no matter who he met, and feel important. And that is an aspect that is something that's cherished because everyone who still says, shares stories will always say, wow, like he came up, he spoke to me, and he listened to me. And I felt like I was the most important person right then and there. And that's how he
mm.
made people feel. And I don't know if it was because he also had cancer and realized of life. So, but that is, and just his sense of humor. It was very British. People used to
Oh,
say
really?
he had a, yes, he had a dry sense of humor. I mean, I got it because that's my sense of humor too.
Sounds like,
It's
I was just going to say, it sounds like he has left a beautiful legacy behind. I think what a gift for somebody to be able to leave somebody with those feelings that they're important.
mhm. I always kind of go, for me, I got to learn from him. And it's funny because people will come up who have known my son afterwards, will kind of go, oh, he has so many qualities of you. And it's amazing. I mean, it's wonderful to hear that, but I guess when they're growing up, you don't see it. You don't see
Mm.
your own qualities in your children.
Okay. Is there anything that you haven't said that you would like to say before we end?
I first of all want to thank you for having this space that people can share about the grief and showcasing how grief is different, right? In the
Yeah.
sense of there isn't a one way fits all sort of thing. Admire that you are doing this and that you're reaching out to people. For my own self, what I want to leave people with is that your grief matters and no one to make you feel insignificant because what you are feeling. Seek out support or communities where you get to be yourself, where you are accepted, because grief really does need to be witnessed. And I truly believe that people need to be acknowledged for their experience of what they're going through.
Yeah, thank you so much. And if people are interested in your program or interested in working with you, how would they reach you?
At hope at mariabelanic.com. See, I knew I love the word hope.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
right. So yes,
your
that's my email.
website, your social media?
On Instagram, I'm at a grief unscripted, or you can look up my name and that will also pop up. Um, I mean, I've shifted from being a real estate agent for 26 years to being a grief educator because of my own experience, and also of wanting to help and serve other people in their grief journey. Because you definitely need someone to walk on that journey so you're not alone. And I don't want anyone else to have to go through 10 years of being in limbo or having 10 years that's a blur the way I did. And I feel that I've lost 10 years of my life.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. And for anybody that's listening, I just think to reach out to somebody like Maria, people with that lived experience that can help, I think is so invaluable. People that really get it. So I will link to your email address and your social media as well in the show notes so people can see that there. And thank you so much for coming on and sharing your experience and your wisdom.